You know, many of you, as Americans, we are familiar with Mount Rushmore. And in South Dakota, you have, you know, the portraits, I would say the profiles of faces of 4 American presidents, chiseled in stone, and 4 Americans who really made a difference. It got me thinking, who really made a difference in terms of at least the part of the Middle East dealing with facilitating Arab-Israeli peace or coexistence. They may be, some are peacemakers, but don't have to be peacemakers per se, but made a contribution that really made coexistence possible. And for me, it's who took the impossible, or the seeming impossible, and made the impossible possible. Who would I put in that category? So I've got 4 candidates, 2 Arabs, 2 Israelis. But I'm sure, and I hope you guys will study the subject, you'll maybe come up with your own list, and they'll be different. So, you know, I just think that when I think of like who helped change the Middle East, who are the ones that maybe at great personal sacrifice, and in some of these cases gave their lives, but they showed that just because something is difficult, it doesn't mean it's not important. Usually if it's difficult, it's very important. As you know, there are moments in your lives when you see something differently than you ever saw it before, and it changes your view forever. So my political coming of age, I was a teenager, 1977, when Anwar Sadat, the president of Egypt, made an electrifying, historic trip to Israel. And the Middle East was never the same after Anwar Sadat's trip. You know, you often hear, oh, this conflict, they've been killing each other forever, maybe 2,000 years. Not true. The modern nationalism certainly of Israelis and Palestinians, about 120 years. That's still a long time, I grant you that. But it's not impossible. Few people really made that possible, that you could bring these enemies together. And one of them was Anwar Sadat. And former Prime Minister of Israel, Golda Meir, likened when Sadat came to the arrival of the Messiah. Think of it, a Jewish woman, a Jewish mother, a Jewish grandmother, saying about this Arab man, he's like the Messiah. A guy who tells the Egyptian parliament, I will travel to the ends of the earth, even to Jerusalem, you know, if I could help my people, the Arab people. And he did it, and it was transformative. Now, him and Begin, Menachem Begin was the Prime Minister of Israel. They appeared together in the Knesset, and the words that became associated with both of them was that they talked directly to the people, not just to each other. No more war, no more bloodshed. And you got to realize that there were wars here between these peoples. 1948, 1956, 1967. There was a war of attrition in 69-70. There was a war in 1973. And Sadat said enough. And he had the blinding insight to realize that if you talk to people, you will get your land back through peace and not to the battlefield, which was unheard of. On March 26, 1979 was the first Egypt-Israel peace treaty. It was the first peace treaty of any Arab country. But Egypt was the strongest. And without Egypt, there was no war. And people said, we're going to be mad at you, Sadat. We're going to close our embassies as Arab countries in Egypt. And he said, Egypt's the strongest country of the Arab world. You think you're isolating me, you're isolating yourselves. And in truth, within 10 years, they all resumed regular, normal relations. The point was, Sadat had the vision, had a strategic plan, and he followed it with a bold leap. And he paid with his life. He was, gunned down by an assassin at a parade in Egypt, but the peace endured. A second name, also a person who paid with his life, was a guy by the name of Yitzhak Rabin. And I get a bit emotional talking about Rabin because I was a journalist who used to cover Rabin. And he was the war hero who won the 1967 war. But after he won the war, what he realized was, what did he win? On one hand, it was remarkable. It's called the Six-Day War. Israel was invaded by different Arab armies, but it tripled its size. But then he said, and people were ecstatic, Jerusalem had been now all under Israel control. The Israelis were. The Arabs were totally shattered. Like, how could in 6 days this little country that only exists for 19 years beat all these Arab armies combined? But over time, Rabin realized that there's a burden here of occupation, that you are now controlling the lives of Palestinians of the West Bank and Gaza. And in Gaza, there was being, before the war, was controlled by Egypt, and then before the war, the West Bank was controlled by Jordan. And there was no Palestinian state in those pre-67 years. But his view was, wait a second, the whole idea of Israel's existence and the whole idea of Zionism is to be a nation state of the Jewish people, but with equal rights for everyone, and to be a democracy, to be part of the Western world. And he said, the demographics here scare me a bit here, because if we don't give these people rights, then Israel will either become, it won't be a Jewish state, or it won't be democratic. So if they don't get rights, it won't be democratic. And they might outnumber the Israelis. And if you do give them rights, then it won't be Jewish. It was like a Rubik's Cube kind of thing. So there was only one way to keep the character of the country and to keep it democratic, and that was divide the land. Because here were two nationalisms, Jewish nationalism, Zionism, and Palestinian nationalism. They were fighting over the same little piece of land. You're never going to solve the past and these irreconcilable historical narratives. But what you want to do is make sure that the past doesn't bury the future. You want to make sure that young people have a better life. And so Rabin was now an old man, and he said, we got to solve this conundrum. I won the war of '67, but we never solved the problem, which is you're going to have to divide the land. So that the Palestinians would be free, but that the Israelis would maintain the character of their state. So he greenlighted two enemies sitting together, Rabin's people and Yasser Arafat's people. Yasser Arafat running the Palestine Liberation Organization. And they reached a breakthrough. And for me, it was I would say, it was an amazing moment to be on the White House lawn, September 13th, 1993, and Bill Clinton being there, and these two guys shook hands. The nature of it, of course, was that not all the issues were resolved in those secret talks in Oslo. And there were some really tough issues, and they had to kick the can down the road. And for me, working for Secretary of State John Kerry during these peace talks, it was a real privilege this year and last year, because this was in many ways the unfinished business of the Oslo handshake, was to try to solve the toughest issues that they couldn't solve in Norway. So, but Rabin, what I admired about him was his ability to talk directly to people and to tell them, listen, I won the war of '67, but we can't keep the fruits of that war, because if we want to give the Palestinians a better future, we'll give Israel a better future. And we're going to have to make painful territorial concessions. And he was very blunt. He didn't mince words. And I realized then, leadership is not just saying tough things to the opposing side. Leadership is saying tough things to your own people. And that really, there's two negotiations going on. You're negotiating with the other side, but you're also negotiating with your own people at the same time. And sometimes that second negotiation is really very hard. And I'll never forget my last interview with him, and I was fortunate to have many with him when I was a journalist. And it was in his office a few weeks before his assassination in Jerusalem, and I could barely hear him speak, because in those days, they allowed the protesters almost to be outside his window, maybe 50 feet away. But they were so boisterous, I couldn't hear him. And I said, you have to deal with this every day. How do you deal with it? I mean, does it dispirit you? Does it make you want to give up? He said, I'm not giving up. And I just came away saying, wow. I mean, I couldn't say that as a journalist, because you're not allowed to, but in my heart, I thought, wow, this guy's got a lot of guts. And then at a peace rally, tragically, he sang the song of peace. He walked off the stage to his car, and it was a fanatic, Jewish fanatic, and killed him. And I remember doing the ABC news commentary for that funeral of Peter Jennings, and you had to fight back the tears. It was such a sad day. I remember when I was in private, I cried. It was the first time since my mom died 15 years earlier that I cried, but when Rabin was killed. Now I want to talk to you about two other people who I would put on that Middle East Mount Rushmore, who are not classic peacemakers. A guy by the name of Danny Gold. Danny Gold is not a prime minister. He's not a president. He doesn't run a political party. But I would put him on the Mount Rushmore because he was an innovator of technology, and a technology that I think is going to have an impact on the way of warfare. He is the chief scientist for Israel's defense ministry, and Gold's whole idea is the father of what's called Iron Dome. It's a system that shoots rockets out of the sky. When I said that Sadat was a hero, in my view, because he ended the interstate wars that were going on every few years between Egypt, Syria, Jordan, Israel. But while those interstate wars ended after the 73 war, what's emerged in the last 30 years is the second type of warfare is the non-state actors. Groups like Hezbollah, groups, and they have changed Israel's regional landscape. It looks to its north. In the old days, they would have it looks quaint. They would have all these tank warfare things with uniforms, and people would be in a battlefield. Now people just fire rockets at civilians. And you have, Hamas in Gaza, and there's been wars there with 2008-9, 2012, this summer. I was in the government 2014 in the United States government. There's Hezbollah wars 2006. And you have this thing called Jabhat al-Nusra, an offshoot of al-Qaeda that has taken over the southern part of Syria. You have Salafis in the Sinai fighting both the Egyptian military and Israel by firing rockets. But the nature's changed. There's no front anymore. In certain ways you could say it's better now. They're not fighting states, but it's worse now because these rockets have farther and farther ranges, and they could hit almost anywhere in the country of Israel, and that also means that Israel retaliates, and it's a spiraling violence. But this guy comes along, this guy Danny Gold, and says, hey, you might not have to do any of this, because what we could do is we could just knock these rockets out of the sky. You can hit a bullet with a bullet. So I talk about making the impossible possible. That's what he was about. Now, I would argue that also ended up saving Palestinian lives, because if Israel did not have force to just go in to stop the rocket fire, it was able to then not retaliate against the point of entry of rocket fire, and that ended up saving a lot of Palestinian lives too. Technology, we always think of a force for good, but the longer these rockets, technology meant that everybody's vulnerable. And this guy comes along and says, no, maybe you don't have to fight, because this is a different sort of enemy than you had before. And what you had this summer, which I think was remarkable, was that you had basically Israel, the Palestinian Authority, the governments of the Gulf, of the Persian Gulf, like Saudi Arabia, the Arab Emirates, Egypt, Jordan, all on the same side, saying we don't want Hamas to win. And we want to bring the Palestinian Authority back into Gaza so that the Palestinians have a better future. And that's what I think that this Danny Gold was able to do, to identify there's a new enemy. Technology always isn't good, but try to hit the bullet with the bullet. And that was, in my view, making the impossible possible and saving lives. And now we got to use that to bring people to the table. And that brings me to my last speaker, my last guy on the Mount Rushmore, the last hero that I want to talk about is a Palestinian who might be known to some of you, maybe not all of you. I've spent close to 40 hours with him in his office in Ramallah, and he, I think, is a heroic figure. His name is Salam Fayyad. He was the Prime Minister of the Palestinian Authority, and he had an amazing insight. He was a man of great courage, because there was a kind of an old school of doing things, blame everybody else, but don't forced to blame your, look inward. And he said, this is wrong. This is kind of almost the soft bigotry of low expectations. What we got to do is, we got to govern ourselves. We have a right to a state, but our way to statehood is not to just blame the international community. Our right to statehood is that we built ourselves up. We govern ourselves. We improve economic development opportunities. We focus on those internal issues that are maybe not, sexy, but infrastructure. We build hospitals, we build schools, we build clinics. Let's do that. And by doing that, we will create an ethos of accountability, not the ethos of blame, and we will show people and the Israelis that we have a right to govern and to have our own state. Look at what the Zionists did. They declared their state, the UN blessed it. It wasn't just Israel doing it, it was the UN in 1947. But it was really between 1917 and 1947, from the Balfour Declaration of Britain during World War I to 47, that they built the institutions of statehood. So when they declared that state on May 15, 1948, they had already built the state. And he said, that's the model. They built universities, they built schools, they built hospitals, they built governing institutions, and that's the way we got to do it too. We can't wait for anyone else. We want a state, we got to build it ourselves. And so these four people, in my view, are heroic figures, two Arabs, two Israelis, who took what was impossible and now made that impossible possible. At the peace table that I was a witness to, working for Secretary of State Kerry just now, until recently, I saw these two sets of people grappling with their differences, narrowing them, not closing the gaps, but narrowing the gaps. And I believe that the impossible could be possible. But they're doing it on the shoulders of giants. And I think what it teaches me is that we have to all summon the greatness within each of us to do what we can. Maybe we won't be on that Mount Rushmore, but we can contribute whatever we can. That this sense of reconciliation, sense of coexistence, that seemed impossible before Anwar Sadat's visit, is now within, it's something we can almost touch. And so I feel that we have to make sure that we don't let extremism triumph. We don't import the politics of confrontation from the Mideast. We export, if anything, the politics of coexistence, of pluralism from the United States. That we don't turn our campuses into mutual recrimination grounds, but we do whatever we can to move these people very close, move them closer. And I think we do what we can. Hopefully we can add more names to that Mount Rushmore, more faces on that mountain. And I hope that we'll be able to see it with our own eyes and witness it in our own lifetime. It'll only be possible if we do what we can to make the impossible possible. So I want to thank you all very much.